George Whitman had lived a life of comfort. At 72, the retired business owner had built and sold more businesses than he could count. But lately, the quiet in his spacious home felt heavier than peace. It felt hollow. One late afternoon, on his way back from a drive through a rural part of the state, his car, a brand new black Lexus, rolled to a stop on the side of a cracked two-lane road. A flat tire, no signal, no traffic. He sighed, tapping the steering wheel. For the first time in years, he felt helpless. Just then, a boy on a rusty bike pedaled up the dirt shoulder. He couldn't have been more than 14, wearing a faded hoodie and sneakers with duct tape on the toes. "You need help, sir?" the boy asked, resting one foot on the ground. George was caught off guard not just by the boy's presence, but by the calm in his voice. "You know how to change a tire?" George asked. The boy grinned. "Yes, sir. My mum taught me." And without waiting for a reply, he dropped the kickstand and got to work. Malik worked quickly and carefully, his hands moving with the kind of confidence that only comes from doing something out of necessity, not choice. Within 15 minutes, the spare was on and tightened down. He wiped his hands on the back of his jeans and stood, breathing a little heavier from the work. George opened his wallet without thinking, pulling out a crisp $50 bill. "Here, son, you've earned this." But Malik shook his head. "No thank you, sir." George blinked. "Why not?" the boy shrugged. "Because helping someone doesn't need a reward. My mum says kindness is free, and we should give it whenever we can." For a moment, George didn't speak. The words hit harder than expected, not because they were dramatic, but because they were rare. Malik tipped his head politely and turned toward his bike. "You have a good day, sir." And just like that, he pedaled away, disappearing down the road with the sunset at his back. George stood there for a while, still holding the money in his hand. Something about that moment, it didn't leave him. In fact, it followed him home. That night, George sat in his leather recliner, staring at the television, but he wasn't watching. His mind kept replaying the boy's voice, the simplicity of his words, the duct tape on his shoes. He had met thousands of people in his life, business partners, CEOs, lawyers, but no one had ever turned down money with such quiet confidence. The next morning, George got in his car and retraced his route, determined to find Malik. He stopped at a gas station in the nearby town and asked around. "Kid on a bike? Wears a grey hoodie?" One man nodded. "That sounds like Malik. He and his mum live over in Willow Court." George followed the directions to a row of aging trailers. He spotted Malik's bike leaned against a porch railing. The home looked worn, paint peeling, the porch sagging. He knocked softly. A woman opened the door, her eyes cautious but kind. "I'm looking for Malik," George said. She hesitated, then called behind her. "It's okay, Mum," Malik's voice came. "That's the man from the flat tire." When Malik stepped into view, George smiled. "You helped me. Now it's my turn." George didn't show up with grand gestures or a news crew. He came back 2 days later with groceries bags full of fresh produce, pantry staples, and a box of Malik's favorite cereal. Tasha, Malik's mom, tried to protest, but George waved her off gently. "Just returning a favor," he said. Over the next week, George worked quietly behind the scenes. He hired a local contractor to inspect the trailer, then paid for repairs, new insulation, a fixed roof, running hot water. A neighbor whispered, "That old man's doing God's work." George never confirmed it. He just kept showing up with a new winter coat for Malik, with job referrals for Tasha, with tools and supplies to build Malik a proper desk for school. One afternoon, Tasha stopped him on the porch. "Why are you doing this?" Her voice was soft but steady. George looked out at the yard and said, "Because your boy reminded me what it feels like to be seen. I've had money for years, but no one's looked at me like that in a long time." She didn't answer. She just nodded and understood. The changes weren't instant, but they were real. Tasha found steady work at a nearby clinic, and Malik's grades started climbing. He had a desk now, a quiet space to study, and shoes that didn't let in rain. George started visiting more often, not out of obligation, but because he wanted to. He'd sit at the kitchen table sipping tea, listening to Malik talk about space and airplanes. "I want to be an engineer someday," the boy said one afternoon. George smiled. "I think you already are. You fixed something most people overlook." Malik raised an eyebrow. "A flat tire?" George chuckled. Number perspective. Slowly, the trailer that once sagged with weight began to feel lighter, brighter. They planted flowers out front. George helped repaint the siding. Neighbors stopped to admire it. "Looks different," someone said. Tasha answered, "Feels different too." For George, what started as a simple flat tire had turned into something he hadn't expected. Family. Not by blood, but by choice. And for the first time in years, he didn't feel retired. He felt alive. As months passed, George and Malik became a familiar pair around town. They fixed bikes for neighborhood kids, handed out warm meals on chilly weekends, and showed up at local school event 7 when Malik wasn't performing. George became known as Mr. G to most of the children, and they treated him like one of their own. But what touched him most wasn't the attention, it was the sense of purpose. For years, George had poured his energy into building companies, but now, helping this one family was building something deeper. He and Malik began working on a side project together, a small community library, built from reclaimed wood and filled with donated books. Malik painted the sign himself, "Take a book, leave a book." People stopped by daily. Tasha once joked, "You two are doing more good in this town than city council ever has." George laughed, but quietly treasured the thought. He never expected a boy with duct-taped shoes to change his life. But every time he looked at Malik, he saw hope. And in helping Malik, George realized something he'd almost forgotten. It's never too late to start giving with your heart. One cloudy afternoon, almost a year after that flat tire, Malik spotted a car pulled over on the same road where he'd first met George. The driver, a young woman in her 20s, looked flustered, struggling to open the trunk. Without hesitation, Malik stopped his bike, approached her with a familiar smile, and asked, "Need a hand?" 10 minutes later, the spare tire was on, and the woman was speechless. "How do you know how to do all this?" she asked. Malik wiped his hands and shrugged. "Someone once helped me the same way. I'm just passing it on." Back home, George listened as Malik shared the story. He didn't interrupt, but just watched with a soft, proud smile. When Malik finished, George nodded slowly and said, "You didn't just change a tire, kid. You changed someone's day, maybe even their life." Malik looked up. "Like you did mine." George chuckled. "Number, you did that on your own. I just happened to be watching." That night, the two sat quietly on the porch, side by side. No words were needed. The road that had once left George stranded had now led him home.